They haven't sprayed a single chemical on their crops in over 300 years, and their gardens still beat yours. Here's exactly what they do differently. There's a particular kind of frustration every gardener eventually runs into, and if you've grown anything for more than a season or two, you already know it well. You put in the work. You start seeds indoors in late winter. You harden them off carefully. You transplant them at just the right time, and for a few weeks everything looks perfect. Then one morning you walk outside with your coffee, and something has changed overnight. There's a hornworm the size of your finger stripping a tomato branch bare. There's a cluster of aphids marching up a pepper stem like they've claimed the territory. There are tiny shot holes riddling your cabbage leaves, and no matter how closely you look, you can never quite catch the culprit in the act. So you do what most of us have always done. You reach for a spray, whether it's a synthetic pesticide or an organic alternative like neem oil, and you treat the plant. Maybe it helps for a few days, maybe a week, but the pests always come back, and worse, you start noticing fewer ladybugs, fewer pollinators, less of the quiet background life that used to fill the garden. It starts to feel like every season is the same fight, fought with the same tools, and somehow you're always one step behind. This is the experience that eventually led a lot of curious gardeners to look at Amish growing communities, particularly the long-established settlements in Pennsylvania's Lancaster County and similar communities in Ohio and Indiana. What people notice almost immediately when they visit these farms is how little damage is visible. The tomato plants are thick-stemmed and dark green. The cabbage heads are nearly untouched. And when you ask how they manage pests without a single bottle of synthetic pesticide, something these communities have avoided for well over a century, the answer isn't a secret product or a hidden trick. It's a completely different starting assumption about what a garden is supposed to be. Conventional pest control, the kind most of us grew up learning, treats the garden as a battlefield. Pests show up, you identify the threat, you deploy a countermeasure, and you repeat that cycle every time something new appears. It's reactive by design, which means you're always managing symptoms after the fact. The approach used in these farming communities flips that entirely. Instead of asking, "How do I kill what's attacking my plants?" the underlying question becomes, "How do I build a garden environment where pests never get the chance to establish themselves at scale in the first place?" That single shift in framing changes almost every decision that follows. What gets planted where, how the soil is treated, which insects are welcomed rather than eliminated, and even how much time is spent simply observing the garden each day, rather than intervening in it. It's worth being honest about something here. None of this is mystical or secret knowledge locked away in one community. It's closer to a deeply refined, multi-generational practice of ecological gardening, techniques that modern agricultural science is now independently confirming through soil biology and entomology research, even if the farmers who developed these habits never used those terms. What makes it worth paying attention to isn't that it's exotic, it's that it works. It's been tested across hundreds of growing seasons and generations of trial and error, and almost none of it requires spending money on another product. It requires spending a little more attention and patience up front, in exchange for a garden that increasingly takes care of itself as the years go on. The first and most overlooked piece of this entire system has nothing to do with bugs at all. It starts underground, in the soil itself, which is exactly where most home gardeners never think to look when they're dealing with a pest problem. The logic is straightforward once you hear it. A plant growing in nutrient-poor, biologically inactive soil is a weaker plant, full stop. And weaker plants are dramatically more vulnerable to pest damage than vigorous, well-fed ones. This isn't a folk belief. It's measurable plant physiology. Soil that's rich in organic matter and teeming with microbial life produces plants with thicker cell walls, denser leaf tissue, and higher concentrations of the natural defensive compounds plants use to deter feeding insects in the first place. A tomato plant grown in compost-amended, biologically active soil is simply a harder target than one grown in depleted, chemically fertilized dirt, even before any pest shows up. So the first practical step, every single spring before anything goes into the ground, is working 2 to 3 inches of well-aged compost into the top 4 to 6 inches of soil across the growing beds. Where it's available, compost that includes aged animal manure, composted over a full winter to avoid burning young roots, adds an even more diverse range of microbial life to the soil, which translates directly into stronger, more resilient plants. This isn't a one-time fix either. It's a practice repeated every year, building soil quality cumulatively over several seasons, rather than expecting a single application to transform everything overnight. Most gardeners who commit to this notice a real, visible difference by the second or third year. Plants that are more vigorous, recover faster from minor feeding damage, and simply look healthier from the moment they're transplanted. The second foundational piece works above ground, and it's a near-total reversal of how most home gardens are laid out. The typical backyard vegetable garden is planted in tidy single-crop rows, all the tomatoes together, all the beans in their own strip, all the squash off to one side, because it's visually organized and makes harvesting simple. But to an insect searching for food, a long, uninterrupted row of one crop functions almost like a beacon. The vast majority of common garden pests, including aphids, cabbage moths, and cucumber beetles, locate their host plants primarily through scent, following chemical cues released by the plants themselves. A dense monoculture row makes that scent trail incredibly easy to follow. Interplanting disrupts this completely. Tucking a basil plant near every few tomato plants introduces a strong competing scent that makes it measurably harder for aphids and hornworm moths to locate their target. Planting dill or cilantro between rows of brassicas like cabbage and broccoli does double duty. It confuses cabbage moths searching by scent, and when those herbs flower, they draw in parasitic wasps and hoverflies that actively hunt and destroy aphids and caterpillar eggs. Even border plantings matter. French marigolds planted around bed perimeters release compounds through their root systems that suppress soil-dwelling nematodes, while their strong scent above ground deters whiteflies and squash bugs. None of these pairings are arbitrary folklore. Each one has a specific, identifiable mechanism behind why it works, and together they form the first real layer of a garden that starts defending itself before a single pest problem ever develops. Once the soil and planting layout are working in your favor, the next major shift is one that most gardeners never think to make: actively inviting insects into the garden rather than treating every bug as an enemy to be eliminated on site. This requires unlearning something almost all of us were taught, which is that seeing insects on your plants is automatically a bad sign. In reality, a healthy garden isn't one that's free of insects. It's one with the right balance of insects, where predator species are present in sufficient numbers to keep pest populations in check naturally, the same way they would in any undisturbed ecosystem. The numbers here are genuinely striking once you look into them. A single ladybug can consume up to 50 aphids in one day. A lacewing larva, in its brief lifespan, can eat well over 100 aphids before it matures. Parasitic wasps lay their eggs directly inside caterpillars like hornworms, eventually killing the host from within, and ground beetles patrol the soil surface after dark, feeding on slugs, cutworms, and other grubs that damage roots and stems. These predators are already present in most environments, waiting for a reason to stay. The problem is that most conventional gardens give them absolutely no incentive to. The fix is to dedicate a small section of the garden, even a single row 2 or 3 feet wide along one edge, to a mix of flowers and herbs specifically chosen to feed beneficial insects throughout the growing season. Sweet alyssum, yarrow, fennel, dill, and Queen Anne's lace are particularly effective, and the key is staggering them so that something is flowering continuously from early spring through fall, since predator insects need a reliable nectar source to stick around rather than move on to a neighboring yard. Alongside this planted strip, leaving small, slightly wild areas, an unmowed patch of clover, a pile of old stones or logs, a section of fence line left alone, provides essential shelter and overwintering habitat. A garden that's perfectly manicured with bare soil between every row might look tidy, but it offers no place for ground beetles or spiders to live, which means those natural predators simply won't be there when you need them. The final piece of this layer isn't something you plant at all. It's a daily habit. Spending 15 to 20 minutes each morning walking slowly through the garden, checking the undersides of leaves, looking for small clusters of eggs, and hand-removing anything concerning into a bucket of soapy water sounds almost too simple to matter, but it's arguably the single most effective pest prevention practice in the entire system. The reason is timing. Serious pest damage rarely comes from one or two insects. It comes from a small population that's allowed to multiply unchecked for a week or two before anyone notices. A tomato hornworm can strip an entire branch of foliage within 48 hours once it reaches full size, and a pair of squash bugs can lay hundreds of eggs within days if left alone. Catching 2 hornworms on a Monday morning walk, before they've had a chance to reproduce or grow large, prevents the 20 hornworm infestation that would otherwise be waiting by the end of the week. It's a small, unglamorous habit, but it consistently catches problems while they're still small enough to solve in minutes, rather than becoming a crisis that demands drastic intervention. The final 2 techniques in this approach are the ones that tend to surprise people most, because instead of trying to keep pests away from the garden entirely, they work by deliberately inviting pests in, just toward the wrong target. This is known as trap cropping, and the logic behind it is almost mischievous in its simplicity. If you plant something pests find even more attractive than your primary crop and place it strategically at the edges of the garden, the pests will overwhelmingly choose the decoy instead of your main harvest. Nasturtiums are a particularly effective example, since aphids are drawn to them far more strongly than they are to beans, peppers, or most vegetable crops. Planting a ring of nasturtiums around the garden's perimeter, or at the ends of rows, draws aphids away from the plants you actually care about, and once those nasturtiums are covered in aphids, they become an easy feeding ground for the ladybugs and lacewings already living in your beneficial insect strip, closing the loop between 2 techniques working together. Flea beetles, which are notoriously destructive to eggplant and young brassica seedlings, can be similarly redirected by planting a row of radishes several feet in front of the main crop. Flea beetles strongly prefer radish foliage and will congregate there first, sacrificing a crop you weren't relying on anyway. Certain squash varieties serve the same purpose against squash vine borers and cucumber beetles, drawing those specific pests toward an expendable planting instead of your primary harvest. None of this requires ongoing labor once it's planted. It's a strategy you set up once at planting time, and it continues working passively for the rest of the season. The last tool in the system is the only one that involves actually making something, and even then it takes about 10 minutes. A homemade deterrent spray using ingredients most people already have in their kitchen. Crushed garlic and hot pepper, steeped overnight in warm water and strained the next morning, creates a spray that, combined with a small amount of plain liquid dish soap to help it adhere to leaves, makes plants taste and smell unpleasant to soft-bodied pests like aphids, without harming beneficial insects the way a broad-spectrum pesticide would. It's important to be clear about what this spray actually does. It doesn't kill pests on contact the way a synthetic chemical would. It deters them, encouraging them to move elsewhere, which is a meaningfully different mechanism and one best used as a supplement to everything else rather than a standalone fix. Applied to the undersides of leaves in early morning or evening, never in direct midday sun, which can cause minor leaf burn when combined with soap, one application typically holds for 5 to 7 days before needing to be reapplied. What ties all of this together, and what makes it genuinely different from simply switching from synthetic sprays to natural ones, is that none of these techniques function in isolation. The compost builds stronger plants. The companion planting confuses pests searching by scent. The beneficial insect habitat brings in predators that patrol continuously without being asked. The morning walk catches what slips through early. The trap crops redirect what's left. And the spray handles only the rare cases that get past everything else. It's not one secret weapon. It's a layered system where each piece reduces the workload on every other piece, which is exactly why a garden built this way needs less and less intervention with every passing season, rather than more.